Today, I have the pleasure of having with me Butch Valdes, who is somebody who I've followed for a number of years as a very unique voice in the Philippines. Butch has a long track record of being somebody who has consistently talked about the danger of a systemic global crisis, a breakdown, and the need for a new financial security architecture based upon certain principles of cooperation, long-term thinking that used to animate the best of our past, including here in the West as well as in the East. Today, obviously, many of those things that Butch has been talking about over many years has been coming to pass. We are in between, as we've spoken about in many of our previous discussions with other RTF dialogue members. We're in between two systems, and what will come online to replace the currently dying order is underdetermined. Butch is the co-founder of many groups, including the Save the Nation movement, as well as the Citizen National Guard. He has a long experience in the civil service, working all the way up to the undersecretary of education in the Philippines, and is a major commentator today. So, Butch, I usually like starting these little dialogues by having the person I'm speaking with speak a little bit autobiographically a little bit. So I was hoping you could say a little bit to our audience about how you found yourself in the position that you're in today as sort of the conscience of the Philippines.
I'm not too sure whether the conscience of the Philippines is accurate, but one of the things that I suppose you feel and I feel, many of our kind get to do is the difficulty of holding back what you know and not being able to share it. And this is what I've felt ever since before. I am a certified public accountant and headed an accounting firm. What you might have in Canada as charter accountants, right? And I was in consulting, and we were a pretty big firm here. We had 800 people, and about half of them are professionals, certified accountants. Now, handling a lot of clients, one of the difficulties I had all the time was not being able to tell my clients the truth about how I perceive the economy to be going. I tended to tell them what they wanted to hear rather than what I felt. And until such time that I decided that this has to stop, and I opened up certain things without leaving the firm, of course. I was managing partner of the firm, but I opened up certain things that will at least get my market at the time where businessmen, get them to start thinking about the future rather than just talking about income and income taxes and how much they have to pay here and there. Going back. So that's the whole thing. So something motivates you, and then you start digging up more, and start asking the reasons why. And as you discover, things start to form in your mind, and you're able to validate this and check this out with other people, and then you start seeing what's gonna happen. And discovering what you might think will happen. I was, I think, at that time, fortunate to be introduced to the LaRouche organization, and everything in the Philippines, anything that had to do with foreign, automatically the bell of CIA keeps on ringing in your ear. And then I was hesitant to even communicate with them, but they were sharing information, and true enough, because it was during the time where we were just about to have a revolution, or a in quotes revolution in 1986. Some of the things that they were saying started opening my eyes. For example, that this whole thing was the ouster of Marcos was not integral in the Philippines. That there were interests outside the country that were wanting to get rid of the guy, no? And there were certain areas that they said were they did not want the Philippines to develop. And certain things that were being done by President Marcos then was moving towards an agro-industrial development entity for us. And I appreciated that, but I suppose the ones that had taken over had a totally different idea. So I started digging up and communicating with the people that I did, and developed a concept that this is the direction of the Philippines. And when you have these ideas, you share it, and you test it out in different symposiums and meetings and conferences, and you feel that you're on the right track. And then, of course, you read some more, like you do. We read whatever we can and put it all together. That means history, philosophy, and the rest of the other things. Then it starts to get clear in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
So after that, like you said, you become the conscience of the guy, because people start listening to you. And when they start listening and you were projecting forecasting how the country was going to go, you tended to be a voice in the wilderness. But nevertheless, since you already knew what you perceived to be true, you can't let go of that. So you just stick by it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you said, events as they happened started proving us right. And the credibility of the group that we had formed started increasing. And up to now, that's exactly what we're doing.
And I would imagine during even the 1990s, the credibility had already really started resonating, though people maybe thought you were crazy at first, because you did end up becoming the undersecretary of education for a small period during the presidency of Estrada, who was the president from 98 to 2000, I believe, or 2001.
Yeah. Well, actually, I was invited to be the undersecretary of education, principally because of my professional background, and not because of my knowledge of some amount of philosophy and history and economics. You see, in the government agency like the Department of Education, which is the largest department in the government, you needed to implement certain controls, internal controls, because there was a lot of graft and corruption, people colluding with others, and the purchases and so on and so forth. And we had to create a system. And that was my background. That was my professional training.
Okay.
So that's what got me into the Department of Education. But despite that, I was supposed to be in the finance area and so on, so administration. You can't keep me quiet. So every time there was a meeting on something with the type of education and so on and so forth, that I was insistent that we needed to change the curriculum, and that the curriculum that we had was not geared towards the kind of ideas that the country should be going to.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that is that if your leader, if the president does not have vision, he does not have a national goal, the whole cabinet and all of the other agencies, of course, will just move along and do their thing. And that is the tug of war that I used to play with our Secretary of Education. That I wanted a change in curriculum, which to some extent there was, and I wanted a special class, even if it was just 40 people and a few teachers, two teachers. I wanted the curriculum in the elementary, in the initial stages, to be changed, and that science be taught in a different way. Science be taught as something that you discover rather than something that is fed to you. Because of course, we know that learning is a process of discovery rather than something that's just fed to you as something that you will memorize. So I was at that time something like an oddball in the Department of Education because I was calling all of them parrots. Parrots who were teaching other parrots. I said, anybody can memorize. Not everybody can think. We must teach the children how to think rather than to memorize. But our whole education, all the way up to college, was just a process of memorizing.
Yeah, that's a major problem across the entire world right now. And it has been for a long time, this idea of getting students to pass the test, to just memorize the right formulas, the right definitions, the right answers, without actually having first gotten the student to awaken, well, what's the question? Why should I care?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you didn't make too many friends in that, being the gadfly in that position.
No, I didn't make too many friends, but I made a few, a few that listened, and those people are still with me. I mean, the ones that listened, and they could see the direction that we needed to go. Yeah, as undersecretary, I was quite like a maverick, I would say things that even if the Secretary of Education was there, I would say things that the trouble with us is we don't have true leadership, and I'm referring to the president. The president must articulate what is this national goal is, where he wants the country to be so many years from now, and 10 years from now, and 20 years from now. So that at least, since we are the producers of raw material, of the labor, we know how to direct education. Our education, I said, is not something like just teaching them how to read and good math, so that they can compete in Singapore and say that we beat Singapore in math for 1 year. And so what? I mean, and then you call yourself educated. I used to criticize this. And some directors and superintendents understood exactly what I was saying.
Well, this sort of bridges us into the next question I had in my mind, because obviously when dealing with education, you're always dealing with the purpose of your society, because you're forming the next generation to go out and be the problem solvers, the mature adults, the problem solvers who will be carrying society forward, not only sustaining what was already built, but improving upon what was built and overcoming the limits to our existence by making discoveries into the laws of the universe, which require creativity. It requires sovereign thinking so that we can discover new resources that we didn't have before. So education is very important for this, but how you've just brushed upon the fact that there's sort of two schools of theory about what education should be, which is either create automatons to go out into the system and maintain the system versus create sovereign human beings who can think and make the system better for people and for the future. So today, Philippines is currently a bridge between East and West, economically as well as culturally. It's very strategic. It's very important on so many levels. So I was hoping that you could maybe say a little bit more about the two futures currently pulling the Philippines in two different directions. And maybe I would ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more on the better nationalist traditions that you've brushed upon already, but that you are trying to revive, that would be more dignified and more in harmony with the better future that you envision for the Philippines.
Okay, as you know, the Philippines was under Spanish rule for about almost 400 years, all the way up to about 1899 or 1900s, and wherein there was supposed to be a Spanish-American war. The president at the time in the U.S. was, I think, McKinley, but instead of actual war being fought, there was some skirmish going on. But the U.S. paid Spain $20 million, and we were given to the U.S. During that 400 years under the Spanish rule as a colony, there were many rebellions, and many people, of course, were killed and executed, and so on and so forth. Lots of them. Towards the end, there was this group of people that, towards the 1890s, groups, what we call ilustrados. They were the educated ones. The education of the Philippines then was more European based than American. So they studied in Europe. They went to Spain, or here in the Philippines, the oldest university here was Santo Tomas, by Catholics, and basically the teaching methods were European. And it's the ilustrados, those that are educated, started how to think, learning how to think, and understood what oppression was. One particular guy, his name is Jose Rizal, who was our national hero, who idolized Schiller, Friedrich Schiller, about and William Tell, and his piece on William Tell. And he used the basic concept of William Tell, and he wrote one of the classics that we have now, called El Filibusterismo. He even translated William Tell of Friedrich Schiller into our local language. And why was this? Because he was intellectual and was going against the oppression by the Spaniard, by Spain, through being the colonizers. And it got together many other people that became our national heroes. And right before the Americans came in, there was a revolt headed by another guy. His name was Andres Bonifacio. And as a matter of fact, my great-great-grandfather was part of that group that wanted to drive out the Spaniards. And then, because of the Spanish-American War, the Americans got in and started influencing our new government. And somehow the Americans were able to influence them. But the dissatisfaction of being under a foreign colonizer continued. And it continued on for some time because we were waging attacks on the American colonizers this time. America, on the other hand, instead of they knew that they could not stop this insurgency. Instead, they taught us, they changed our whole educational system and made it the American method of educating. And then one of the other things that they did was they got our students, young people, to go to the United States and come back.
Mm.
And so they were able to, we became a people who looked forward to being able to go to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Up to now. No?
Mm-hmm.
That became part of our culture. Many families will always want to get their children to study in the United States, up to now. No? So,
yeah, I think that was a technique innovated by the British with their Rhodes Scholarship program to give talented young people scholarships to study in Oxford and then send them back to their local nations to infiltrate
to do damage.
Yes, yes.
So that's exactly what happened. Except for one thing, by the time right before the war, right before World War II, 1936, I think, Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised us independence because we have been harping on independence. And then he asked us also to help him fight the Japanese, and we did. And he, as he promised, on July 1946, we were given independence by the U.S. July 4th, 1946. But Roosevelt had died in 1945, and so this guy Truman made it difficult for us to be given the independence. And he said, if you want independence, you will not get the what do you call this, the pay, the veterans pay. No? Because a lot of our people, a lot of our Filipinos were fighting the Japanese as part of being a colony of the U.S. We were fighting for the U.S. And then Roosevelt promised us that we will get the veterans pay as the same way an American soldier lacks. Mm-hmm. But when Truman got in, he didn't want to give it. But he made us choose. Do you want independence or the veterans pay? And so our people, our representatives said, we want independence. So we got the independence, but we had very lot of difficulty trying to get the veterans pay, which, by the way, up to now, there are still quite a number that had not gotten it yet. No?
Oh, wow.
Up to now. No? So that was Truman. And he started to do certain things to us to destroy the development, the physical, economic development that we started on in infrastructure and so on and so forth. And one of the things that had happened to us in 1950s, in the 1950s, there was a person that got to the Philippines. His name was Yalmar Shah. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
Hitler's banker.
Yes, that's Hitler's banker, right? And he was the only one that never got really, he got exonerated or acquitted in the Nuremberg trials, but he went around lecturing And he came to the Philippines and became a consultant for a presidential candidate. And his name was Macapagal. At that time, if you know, we were under the Bretton Woods Agreement, where there's fixed exchange rates. And this guy, Macapagal, wanted to run for president. And his whole campaign was free market. Allow chocolates to come in, allow the goodies from the United States to come in, and so on and so forth. So he opened up the country by they called it the control, getting away the tariff barriers. This was the experiment of Yalmar Shah, and he was trying. I think he was showing it to the different bankers around, and of course, it didn't take long. After 2 years, we had our first major trade deficit, and we had to borrow $200 million from, I'm not sure where, but we had to borrow $200 million. And we devalued our currency by almost 100%. And from that time on, we were an experiment. But because of what Macapagal did, Marcos came in. Somehow Marcos was able to contain the exchange rate. I'm not sure exactly what he was doing, but he was fighting the devaluation of our currency. They said it's because he had his own gold, which he was able to get during the war. But whatever it is, it stayed more or less in $3.80 to $1. And then by the time it was 1971, Marcos had it, I think, at 4 pesos to $1. That's during Macapagal's time, that was 2 pesos to $1.
Mm-hmm. So he stopped the inflation process.
Somehow he stopped it. And then the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And when the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the bankers came to the Philippines and told Marcos, we think your currency is overvalued and you're going to have to devalue it by 8 pesos to 1, which was 100% devaluation. And when Marcos said, no, we can't do that because the prices are going to go up and the people will blame me. And the bankers said, all right, we will impose sanctions on you and you cannot import oil. We didn't have oil. I remember those times we were on ration. We rationed the gasoline because we only had about 2 months inventory.
This is like 1970, 72, 73?
71, 72, 73, somewhere there.
So around the same time that the oil shocks were happening in the West as well.
Right.
We were told other reasons, but yeah. Okay.
So this was, and Marcos had to accede. And our currency was devalued from 4 pesos to 1 to 7.15 to 1, almost 100%. And from that time on, we were on the floating exchange rate system. And we kept on devaluing our currency as imposed on us by IMF and the bankers. And they somehow were able to kick out Marcos, because Marcos it really seemed like Marcos had his own source of generating funds. But definitely, I'm sure that it was not coming from the national coffers. But somehow we were free of debt, free of foreign debt. And I didn't know how. No, but then we were pushed, and until they didn't want the nuclear power plant to start. They didn't want us to have an energy development program, and so on and so forth, which we had during Marcos. We had an 11-point industrialization program, which was the vision of President Marcos at that time. And they didn't want this. So the campaign against Marcos started, and George Shultz and everybody started to get into the picture. And by 1986, he was out. Now, all of these times, we understood that there was always a foreign influence on us. Never did they leave us. During the time of Macapagal, it was what's his name, Garcia before Macapagal. We always the station chief of the CIA was here. I saw a picture that before of the President Magsaysay in 1953. The President Magsaysay was sitting on his presidential desk, and sitting on the visitor's chair was the CIA station chief, Lansdale, I think his name was. Lansdale. And Lansdale had the tobacco and smoking a cigar, and his 2 feet were on top of the desk of our president. You know, they didn't see much of it, but I was only a student then, but I was appalled by what I was seeing. And so on and so forth. So, and people really did like the situation, but we couldn't get out of the rut that we got into. Until now, of course.
Yeah.
So the passion against foreign intervention is always there. But before it was CIA and up to now, but eventually we found out that it was really a group, including especially the foreign creditors. And of course, the George Soroses get into this play, and IMF and so on.
And so Lord Malloch Brown.
Lord Malloch Brown and all that.
Well, see, I so many people believe to this very day that it was a great thing for the Philippines that Marcos was taken down by the great People's Power movement, and it's a big mythology, which it's a very strong belief. And what you've just said is that no, actually, it's a fallacy, that Marcos was not this evil Hitlerite dictator that we've been told, but actually resisted these international financiers in the defense of the interests of the Philippines and their people, and actually had you touched upon not only did he resist the economic manipulation, but he also tried very hard to unleash economic development, industrial development, and you mentioned the power plant. I was also surprised that the power plant that was built in, I think, 86 or so, it was completed, was never permitted to go online after he was ousted. And to this very day, it's just collecting dust. Could you say a little bit about that? I mean, a lot of people don't know this. Could you elaborate on?
Yeah, I even gave a talk in one of the IAEA seminars here, the International Atomic Energy Agency, when they had a symposium here. They asked me to give a talk and give a little history on the nuclear power plant. The nuclear power plant is about 15 minutes away from we have a beach residence there in the area. So I'm familiar with that because I went up that thing about 5 times already. The nuclear power plant was supposed to have been started in 1984. Together with it, or at the same time as the plant in South Korea. which was a twin plant by Westinghouse. And both of them were supposed to start about the same time. I figured also that it was Marcos who might have been influential in South Korea, President Park, to put up a nuclear power plant. Because at that time, South Korea was not so well developed, and the people could not even leave the country because they were holding on to their foreign exchange and all that. I knew because I flew to South Korea a couple of times. But I said, all of a sudden, they decided to go nuclear when we did. So I figured that maybe Marcos had something to do with that because Marcos was very influential. So, okay. So South Koreans finishes theirs. Ours, we finished ours on time. But Marcos didn't want to start it because of the 3 Mile Island issue. And so he told our Minister of Energy, I want you to double the strength of that power plant, the structure and so on. So there was another year that was consumed for that, to strengthen it. So in effect, the nuclear power plant that we have is even stronger than what they had put up in South Korea. At the same time, Westinghouse was also putting the same model nuclear power plant in Brazil and the other one in Slovenia. So there were 4 of the same kind of nuclear power plant. Korea started theirs in 1984. We were supposed to start 1984, and then it was moved to 1985. But by that time, by end of 1985, Ambassador Bosworth was already working against and the toppling of Marcos. So he convinced Marcos didn't know exactly when he was going to be toppled, but he convinced Marcos that to allow the U.S. inspection of the nuclear power plant. So Marcos said, okay, why don't you check it out? So, but of course they were checking it out and so on and so forth. And they said the only real problem there was not a Class A hospital within 30 kilometers from the power plant, but the Subic Naval Base, which had the Class A hospital, was only maybe about 10 minutes, 15 minutes away from the nuclear power plant. But that's not considered. So that was this beef. In the meantime, he was delaying the starting of the nuclear power plant. And so by early 1986, the People Power Rally started, and the plant has never been able to start. And they worked on Corazon Aquino to mothball it. So from that time, it doesn't operate. We spent a total of Marcos spent about $2 billion putting up the plant, and we spent another $2 billion in payment to Westinghouse, which filed the case against the Philippines for rescinding the contract. They were supposed to finish it, but the Philippines said no, so they filed the case and we lost. And we paid a total of another $2 billion, almost about $100,000 a day from that time up to 2006. So we paid $4 billion for a nuclear power plant, and we have not generated a single watt from it.
Wow! Oh my God! It's like I can imagine a slave fighting for freedom and then being told, not only are we going to put you back in shackles and whip you, but we're going to make you pay for your shackles and your whip.
Right.
It's something else.
Exactly. In the meantime, the No, I just wanted to add
Mhm.
that they really manipulated it that way, and because they used Shell Royal, well, we call it Shell Philippines. You know, that's Royal
Royal Dutch.
British, right? Dutch
Mm.
Shell, and to fund all of these rallies against the nuclear power plant, environmentalists, and so on and so forth. No? And the president of Shell Philippines, his name is Benaventura, as soon as Corazon Aquino mothballed the nuclear power plant, of course, we started to need to import more oil, and the one that got the biggest chunk of the market was Shell, and for his uh, for his service, he was granted a knighthood by the Queen of England.
Oh my God, it's disgusting. And you see how during that period of time, there's so many countries. It's almost every country you look at throughout the 1970s, 80s. There is such a momentum towards breaking free of fossil fuels, which are very much tied to speculative manipulation, since the petrodollar had been just created a little bit earlier. And
Yeah.
you've got Pakistan, you've got Korea, you've got Iran, you've got so many countries trying to go towards a nuclear power energy basket to break free of that and have control of their energy sovereignty. And you have every time you have this, you have always infiltration of foreign influences working to create assassinations, coups,
Right.
other disruptions that then bring these countries back into the oil petrodollar cage for easier manipulation. It happens across the board, and I didn't know about the Philippine situation. And today, the Philippines has a huge energy crisis. Like it's a
Oh
huge
yes,
problem.
we're right in the midst of this whole thing now, trying to get it out. But I just wanted to add
Mm-hmm.
before we shift to that, you're when I gave this talk in IAEA, I ended it by saying we're not too sure whether this was done on purpose, but definitely the Philippines uh, was slated not to go nuclear, and we were supposed to just be importing fossil fuel. But I said one thing that I noticed. I said the fact that the Philippines didn't go nuclear, so did the rest of Southeast Asia. You see, the Philippines at that time was ascendant in Southeast Asia. Marcos was well, not the leader, but he was a ascendant leader at that time, and he was quite influential. And we were sure that if the Philippines was going to go nuclear, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia will go nuclear as well, no? And the rest of the. Now we were not sure about Singapore, but because that's the way they did it. They always followed where we were going to go. No? But when they were able to stop the Philippines from going nuclear, the rest of Southeast Asia didn't. Can you imagine what kind of a aggregation of countries the ASEAN will be, no? If all of us went nuclear at the time?
Mm-hmm.
You know, South Korea had that one unit started in 1984. Right now, South Korea already has 23 nuclear power plants and is actually one of the biggest exporters of nuclear power plants. They just finished 4 nuclear power plants in United Arab Emirates. I think they're building the 2 of Jordan. No? And you can see the kind of development they have. And compared to the Philippines, we retrogressed rather than just not even status quo. We even retrogressed. this is the way they hit the Philippines. And of course, the quality of leadership that we had after that, with Cory Aquino and so on and so forth, up to now, we have presidents, but we don't have leaders.
Mm-hmm.
I remember right after the People Power Revolution of Corazon Aquino, and I was watching live television because she was going to address the U.S. Congress. So she was a special guest, and she was marching in. Right behind her was George Shultz, and he had in his lapel pocket a little corridor, as if though telling everybody that I've got this woman in my pocket.
Wow. The ego of it all, eh?
Yeah,
Uh,
that's
well, that's
yeah.
mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Well, this brings up the next question now, like seeing the potential that was lost today. The Philippines, obviously, you know, it's a member of ASEAN. It was a participant in the recent regional cooperation economic partnership of 15 nations. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, trade deal in history with China. So there's obviously a lot of incentive and potential today for the Philippines to revive a lot of what was lost by joining up with the development process going on with large-scale infrastructure with China and the maritime Silk Road especially. However, a lot of people still say, well, if you do that, you're going to be in a Chinese debt trap. That's what they say. They say, don't do it. Stay away. Stay with the Americans. Be better to be with the devil, you know, they say. How do you respond to such detractors of China's Belt and Road Initiative and respond? Why would it be favorable for the Philippines to work with that process more openly?
Well, first of all, those people are saying that we are going to get into a debt trap are ignorant because we already are in a debt trap. We have been in a debt trap for the past how many decades now? Like I said, our exchange rate before was 4 pesos to 1, but now it's 50 pesos to 1, or it went up to 60 pesos to 1. No, because that's how they create the debt trap. No, they force you to devalue your currency, and that you need more pesos to generate the dollar to pay the dollar debt. No? And what had happened was we doubled our debt, not only doubled our debt, because the foreign debt now is about $100 billion, and we created a domestic debt. We borrowed from ourselves to generate the dollars to pay the debt. So we owe a domestic debt of another $100 billion. So we doubled our total debt exposure because of this. We are in a debt trap. The kind of debt servicing that is required for this is far beyond what our country is capable of producing now, especially now, because we have been converted from what would have been a productive economy to a service economy. And you know, if your whole economy is dependent on overseas Filipino workers, and then the whole world is suffering a meltdown, a financial meltdown, the tendency of these Filipino workers will be to come back, or their income also goes down. So when they come back, there's no work here, and so it's like the devil and the deep blue sea for them. So what can you expect? So we are in a debt trap now. Why China? I would favor China, but I would favor a kind of assistance from China, which is more government to government. Our genius economists who are free marketers, when about $8 billion of projects were going to be financed by China for us. $4 billion of that was government to government, which is cheap and long term for investments. The others were, I don't know what, they decided to make it commercial loans, which was expensive and short term. Every 3 years you have to renew. Why? Because these commercial loans they gave favor to some of the what we call local oligarchs here, and to go into these kinds of businesses so that well, what happens there is those commercial loans, the $4 billion, required a guarantee by the government. So the $4 billion needed another $4 billion hypothecated so that their loans can be given to some private sector people here. And whereas the government to government loans did not need any kind of guarantee except that arrangement. And that we could have we get about 20, 30 years to pay for the government to government loans. And we get 3 years renewable for another 3 years, maybe up to 9, 10 years for the commercial loans, paying 3 times the interest. Now, why is it like that? One is our president is dumb, no? And secondly, these economists that he has are the same economists that were working with the previous administrations, and they're basically free marketers, and conceptually they want a private sector-led growth. A private sector-led growth without the situation, what we have now is not going to work out. We have to get the government to establish investments in infrastructure like energy, water, and so on and so forth. But what they were doing is getting the private sector to go into those infrastructure. Then it kills the people. That's exactly what's happening now.
Sorry, do you have?
I was just gonna add because now you mentioned about did you mention BRI and the Maritime Silk Road? Of course, we're interested in that. As a matter of fact, we have in the early part of Duterte, he already said that we are actually participants in the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And we put up, I think, 50% of what is being required because that's all you can afford. Because we believe in the BRI. And of course, we also believe it's the Maritime Silk Road that we would be more involved in because of the nature of our archipelago. And we would, of course, support this because we can see the benefit that it's going to do for us. But the ones that are against it are all the British and the American influenced people here. They talk about the debt trap. They talk about. I said these guys are really being paid well by the CIA. Exactly. So we're in that fix now.
Okay. On that note, a lot of people had a lot of hope when the build initiative was announced by Duterte a few years back. And certainly on the surface, it looks like it's the right spirit, the right idea that the Philippines had not seen a lot of for a very long time. This idea of large-scale, big projects to really build your way out of crises. However, it hasn't really quite unfolded the way many had hoped up until now. Could you say a little bit about what are the obstacles? You mentioned some of the bad advisors or economic folks around Duterte who he's not aware of, or he's choosing to work with, but whatever the case, can you say some of the obstacles and what you think should be done? What would be the appropriate way, a competent way for such a project and more to occur if the Philippines were to act in accordance with what's truly needed and possible?
Well, we have to, we realize, of course, that there has been some infrastructure construction going on the Department of Public Highways. These are the roads and the bridges. No, they have probably surpassed two administrations' construction work of new roads and bridges connecting different areas, even connecting islands. But that is where our infrastructure building begins and ends. We have one subway that is being built now, but that's financed by Japan. That's going to go only one way first from the southern Manila to the northern part of Manila. That's all it will cross. But now, my beef about the infrastructure projects is they don't have anything on energy. They don't have anything on water. And that's exactly what we needed more than the roads and the bridges. We had a nuclear power plant that can be restarted with less than $1 billion investment. But they didn't push it. Why? Because the private sector, what we call the oligarchs here, are in control of public utilities, including energy, water. Now, if the government starts the nuclear power plant, the tendency is to bring down the prices, and the private sector will be affected if we bring it down. So the private sector is being favored by not going energy. Anything that has to do with government going into energy and water projects was not done. And that's exactly what should have been done. We have several dams that generate electricity. But instead of the government holding on to it, they started to sell it. So it's owned by private individuals now. That's why our energy cost is probably one of the highest in the world now. And where the income, let's say even in Canada, the income in Canada is probably 30 times more than the income of our ordinary people here. And yet we're paying among the highest energy costs here. You know who was complaining? I was talking to a Japanese businessman. And this guy was complaining about energy costs. He's from Japan. You would think that energy is so expensive in Japan compared to the Philippines. And yet he was complaining about the energy charges here. Can you imagine? And I said, yeah, because this is what we did to our country. Our group is, of course, fighting this tooth and nail. We're creating movements and really hammering on the president to do something in accordance with our constitution, because he's mandated by constitution. He's mandated to declare a state of emergency, wherein the public utilities will be turned over back to government. Obviously, to be able to bring down the cost of electricity. We think that the cost of the energy operations can run by at least 1/3 cost of what we're paying now. So the fact of 2/3 is really going to the pockets of these few people, maybe about 10 people. No?
Wow.
So we're hammering on him to follow the Constitution, or else there will be unrest.
Mm.
And this might happen. This might happen. And so we'll see, because it's coming to a head.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, as it is in many countries. You've given me a choice. It's a difficult choice because you've raised two things that I'd like to ask you about. Both the Constitution and the powers of the Constitution in defense of the people, but also the issue of funding. So I think I'd like to, since you brought up the Constitution, and I know it's something close to your heart, it's close to my heart too. I'm in a country here in British Canada where we don't really have a Constitution as such.
Right, I know.
So I really sympathize with people who are really organizing for a real constitution in their own countries. Now, you have said in many occasions that the Philippines has a very ambiguous problem because it has suffered so many unlawful government interventions, both the ousting of Estrada, which one could say what did not happen under any constitutional rules, and the previous 1986 color revolution, which was very unlawful, that ousted Marcos. And today, and you've just mentioned this, you've said that the most probably wisest path would be to reactivate or go back to the 1899 Constitution of the Founding Fathers. And that's something I don't really know about. Could you say a little bit more about why you think that is the wisest approach? What is this Constitution of 1899? How would that empower the Philippines?
That Constitution was done right after the revolution, somewhere in 1898, wherein we elected the president, Emilio Aguinaldo, and there was a constitution formed in Malolos, in some place north of Manila. Now, why that? Because all subsequent constitutions, the next constitution we had was in 1935, that was under the influence of the Americans already. Then after that, a war constitution was made. This time under the influence of the Japanese. After that, there was another constitution was made, which was in 1973, which was a constitution by President Marcos. But the 1973 constitution used the 1935 as a base, which since 1935 was influenced by the Americans, so would in effect 1973. And the 1987, of course, was also influenced by the Americans. So we don't have a constitution that is really Filipino. No, that 1899 constitution is the only constitution that had not been abrogated. The 1935 was abrogated by the 1940s, and then 1940 was abrogated again by 1973, and the 1973 was abrogated by 1987. But the 1899 was not officially abrogated. So there are people that are saying we should all go back to 1899 and start from there and modify it for our present needs, and can claim that this constitution is indeed Filipino. There are certain things there that are of course changing, but there's just the idea of bringing it back to 1899 gives us that nationalist flavor of what we're trying to do. Although this was in 1899, those heroes of ours were influenced by revolutions that happened before, like 100 years before. what was that? There were two revolutions that were very significant at that time. One was in 1776, and the other was in 1789, I think. Oh no, yeah,
The French Revolution was
French Revolution.
1789.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so the revolution, the idea of making change was there. So, and I feel that there was more in the thinking of our people had more the flavor of the American Revolution than the French Revolution, because they were because Friedrich Schiller was and Friedrich Schiller had something to do with Leibniz and so on and so forth with the American Revolution. But at any rate, that is basically the reason. It's just the feeling of being able to do something that was really Filipino. And then we will come up with a modified constitution from there, and work it out that way. Because all the rest we had to throw out. And nobody respected our constitution. This constitution, nobody respects it. None of the previous administrations respected it. They were kept on violating it left and right. And they had Supreme Court justices who were for sale. They just negated everything that is there in our Constitution. You know, in the US, we have what you call visiting forces agreement, wherein they're supposed to be allowed to fly our territory. And visiting forces means they can stay here for 2 weeks or something like that. But they stay here permanently. The MDT, the Mutual Defense Treaty, which was 1950s, and now it's time for renewal again. But there is no Mutual Defense Treaty. There is no commitment for us to be defended by the Americans. But there is a commitment for us to defend the Americans if they get to war here. And then there is now the EDCA. The EDCA is the most onerous. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Americans now are able, by the EDCA agreement, can put up a military installation inside the Philippine military camps. And this military installation inside the military camps are off limits to Filipinos.
Wow. Oh, wow.
Not even our president can go inside there without permission. We don't even know what is inside there. They were able to do this for 5 military camps already. Until Duterte said that's enough. They were supposed to put it in 8. I suspect, of course, that these installations are nuclear launching pads.
That is incredibly dangerous. The possibility that could be the case has huge ramifications, considering the fact that we know that the U.S. military has been encroaching and encircling upon China as part of a full spectrum dominance strategy now for a number of years. So if that is true, I mean, that is something which would put a giant target on the Philippines as a whole. And also, I mean, how do you even... There's no way to verify? This is something that's completely secretive?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, I've been asking some generals, do you know what's inside? No, it's off limits. No. I've asked our Secretary of Defense directly, what is inside there? Have you seen it? He didn't answer. No. I figured he didn't see it either. No. And then, But you see, the Philippines, the territorial waters of the Philippines, the American warships have free access to them. The American warships have free access to our ports and our airports. This is a commitment given by the previous administration and supported by the Supreme Court as constitutional. Right? That's what I mean by our Supreme Court. So we've got that kind of a situation.
Mm-hmm.
On the West Philippine Sea, I don't know if you want to dwell on it, but we have a proposal. Our party has a proposal. Of course, we have a party. No? We have a political party.
We didn't talk about that in your interview. I know about that, but say something about your party and about its initiatives. I think that would be a nice way to close out the this discussion. But certainly, please do.
Yeah, okay. Well, we organized a political party. The party I organized it as early as 2003, just in case we were going to need it at some point. But we didn't until 2018, wherein we used it to run for the Senate in 2019. But then, actually, not with expectation of winning, but to see whether our people were susceptible or to ideas rather than the money, because everything here is bought. And we were pleasantly surprised that there were quite a number of people that were listening to the ideas that we could come up with. So we were, I said, we were a party of ideas and not personalities. And that is the kind of slogan that we used to say. And then we had a program. But one of the things that we wanted to do for foreign policy had something to do with the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea. And I was going to use the principles of the Treaty of Westphalia and move according to those same concepts. Wherein the Philippines was going to, since the Philippines is just a small country, we cannot go directly to China, and China does not really give much importance to what we say. I said, if the Philippines, because our president seems to be very popular, can get the whole ASEAN countries together, and there are 10 ASEAN countries, and then the 10 ASEAN countries together will go to China and tell China that we would like China and the 10 ASEAN countries to grant to guarantee a freedom of navigation for all countries, the US and everybody, including their military warships, to ply the waters all the way up to the north, to guarantee that. Now, since that is what is being mouthed by the US, that it's freedom of navigation, then maybe they may say, okay, even if it's just a formality, but after that, since you already got the guarantee, maybe China should start constructing the Crack Canal. The Crack Canal, as you know, is in the isthmus of Thailand, and that will open up another way to go in and out of the China Sea from the Indian Ocean, so that it's not just the Malacca Straits, which is really the area that is very sensitive. If there are two ways, then it becomes redundant, and there might not be too much of a conflict. And since there is a freedom of navigation, it will push it. Now, after that, the stakeholders in the ASEAN, China included, Philippines and the rest of them, will be free to get into a economic cooperation or on business economic projects of for oil exploration and whatever have you, in this whole area, including the United States, if it so want, if it wanted to. Why? Because the principle is, do not use this area as territorial boundaries. You must use this whole area of China Sea and the Malacca Straits as economic corridors, that will allow us some mutual benefit for the future, without sacrificing our official claims of economic zones. I thought that it might, since it's not being suggested by anybody, it's a shot, it's a long shot, but at least it's different. And I think, and since it is historically based, the Treaty of Westphalia, the same concept, proposing to the benefit of the other. So it might open some discussions, and we might be successful in getting the ASEAN countries, who themselves are very nervous about the coming war between China and the US in the area, might listen to this. But nobody from our government is familiar with this, and no one is going to talk about it except us.
Well, yeah, and I mean that is such an important lesson for people, because even now, those who are savvy in affairs of political economy, they think of the Peace of Westphalia as being nothing more than just a treaty that settled that created the basis of international law, premised around the idea of just ignoring your neighbor, respecting your neighbor's right to be left alone. And it's indicative of the fact that they're not actually reading the treaty itself, which
That's
very
right.
clearly says right in the preamble that this only works if every nation is working with a spirit of brotherly love and the benefit of the other, of its neighbor. Otherwise, there's no meaning.
Yeah.
So to revive that, and also do you have any thoughts about the synergy between that and the five principles of peaceful coexistence, which seems to me like it was something in 1955 that tried to revive that spirit?
But even that Treaty of Peaceful Coexistence and the Treaty of Westphalia, those agreements would not really prosper too long, or would not really mean anything, unless there was economic benefit to the people. Right. And in the Treaty of Westphalia, there was. This guy, what's his name?
Colbert?
Jean-Baptiste Colbert. When he said that the River Rhine and the tributaries must be free from toll, and that allowed the freedom of navigation, right? And then you only pay the tariff if you're going to go into somebody's real territory and you sell your goods there. So there was economic benefit.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, that whole thing, as it spread towards the rest of Europe, that was one of the major instances where Europe became Europe. Because prior to that, there was no such thing as Europe. They were all separate countries, right? But when they started thinking along those lines, so that there was common benefit, the idea of Europe, I suppose, started with that kind of cooperation.
Absolutely.
So there has to be economic benefit to the people. That's why even in this thing that we're saying, for the China Sea, it's not territory, it's not sovereignty and patriotism and all of that sort of thing. You don't lose any of those principles by working together with others.
Absolutely. And that is, again, the idea. Many people say, oh, you can't build a big project, a big water project like Transaqua in Africa, because it involves so many countries that have so much hostility against each other. They would never come to the table at the same time. And it's like, well, if you're going to wait for them to all be friends before you start building anything, you're going to wait forever. It's not going to happen. You have to start the process. And then in doing so, and you realize that we're all reaping the fruits, benefiting from this project. Oh, and then the spirit can begin to heal from all of its past prejudices and everything else. So it's wonderful that you're putting the Canal and these big projects right on the table with this principle in mind. It's very, very important. If people want to know more about your work, about the political party, your initiatives, can you say something about what websites they can go to, how they can get in touch, get involved if they're in the Philippines listening to this?
Well, we've got the website, and we are in Facebook and YouTube, and they can always look us up there. But and we're always going to be available for anybody outside the Philippines to contact us through the website. We're on. We have a program, and if they follow the KDP. KDP is the Katipunan Demokratikong Pilipino. It's like it's in Filipino, but it's like a Democratic Party of the Philippines. It's we have television shows, programs, but not most of them talk shows. Most of them talking about politics and economics and issues like the vaccines and the ivermectin and the so on and so forth, and the population and so on. Sometimes they talk about these things in the station, but most of it really is addressed to our administration, what has to be done. We are not directly against the president, but we are calling on him to do his duty, to follow the Constitution. And if he doesn't follow it, he may regret it very soon. Now, our party has been it's different in the sense that we really stick to our principles and what we say. We are not a party of just trying to get a lot of following, whoever they are, we can come and go every Tom, Dick, and Harry is there. We're kind of not elitist in the sense that, but we know who to include in the party. Generally, you will see them by their ideas and how much they want to change the country. The others are just agrupations, they're gangs. The parties we have here now, they're owned by the oligarchs. They're rich, of course, they have a lot of funding, but they have no ideas. They don't have any ideas that we're saying now. They can't even say that. They can't even go and criticize the fact that we're paying the highest electricity rates in the world. Why? Because the oligarchs will get mad at them because they're owned by the oligarchs. So it's a niche that we've been able to do. And I think very soon, if we ever reach election time next year, well, before the end of this year, I think people will realize that we are a party to contend with. And we will have a very popular support.
Well, I think in a time of crisis, when it becomes impossible to ignore the fires that have been sort of burning, but at enough of a distance that one could keep their eyes closed and still believe that there will be stability tomorrow. At a time of crisis, those fires can't be ignored anymore, and it starts to hurt. And I think at those points, people start paying more attention to those who they were ignoring. The Cassandras, the prophets who were being ignored for much of human history, and they're all of a sudden looking for water. and the prophets are the only person saying, "Look, I've been telling you, the water's right here."
Right.
And so yes, I think you're putting yourself in the position of being, as we started this conversation, you got a little shy when I called you the conscience of the Philippines, but I believe that you've lived up to it in the course of this conversation. And for anybody who wants to know more, I will put all of the links to your websites and other things
Yes,
in the
please.
description to this video.
Yes, please.
And thank you so much, Butch, for taking the time this evening
Well,
to talk to me and to talk
I
to Rising
enjoyed
Tide.
it. I enjoyed it, Matt, and I enjoyed meeting you finally. As you know, I follow you and Cynthia, and I appreciate everything that you're doing. And practically all, I keep on sharing it. I hope you don't mind, but I keep on sharing it to all of my friends in Facebook. So
Oh,
you're pretty well read.
we are honored, Butch, and Cynthia, I know, would like to be here the next time, and hopefully next time we do one of these conversations, we could focus a little bit on education, which we only brushed upon, but I think
Yes,
that
sure.
that discussion needs to really be unpacked a lot more.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Great.
Um, that's an area which we really have to how to say renovate here in the Philippines. I suppose everywhere.
Definitely. All right. So till next time.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.